For more than 6 decades, Robert Duvall has been the quiet heart of American cinema. It is time to tell the truth. The name fell like thunder. Marlon Brando, Duvall said, his voice calm but absolute. The most destructive ego I ever encountered. For a moment, the interviewer thought he had misheard. Brando was supposed to be untouchable, the saint of method acting, the man who reinvented modern performance. To hear Duvall, a lifelong admirer of discipline and craft, describe him that way was to feel the earth tilt beneath a century of film history. He did not deny Brando's genius. He was brilliant, Duvall said, but brilliance without discipline is chaos. Their paths had collided in 1966 on the set of The Chase. Those words fell like an earthquake through the marble halls of Hollywood. To audiences, the film was a Southern tragedy about corruption and violence. To those behind the camera, it was a psychological battlefield. Duvall remembered the smell of dust and sweat, the relentless Texas heat, and a director struggling to control 2 powerful egos, one silent, one explosive. Brando, already a legend, had long ceased to respect directors. He would change lines mid-scene, mumble different words, or shift his tone so drastically between takes that editors could not cut the footage together. He called it protecting the truth of performance. Duvall called it something else. He would sabotage other actors to prove his point, he said. That was not art. That was cruelty dressed as genius. This was not a forgotten actor settling old scores. The breaking point came during one of Duvall's key monologues. The cameras rolled, the room fell silent, and just as he began, a faint sound, a tap, a huma, echoed off camera. Small enough to ruin the take, but subtle enough to deny. It happened again, and again. After the 5th interruption, Duvall turned toward Brando and said nothing. The set froze. Brando smiled. "Oh, maybe you should be stronger in your choices," he said. The crew looked away. This was Robert Duvall, an artist long defined by restraint, deciding that silence had become a lie. No one dared intervene. That was the hierarchy of power in Hollywood. The untouchable genius and the professional gentleman locked in a silent duel. He wanted to prove that no one could outshine him, Duvall recalled. And maybe no one could. But that was not strength. That was insecurity with applause. Years later, when The Godfather united them again under Francis Ford Coppola's direction, they shared no scenes together. Publicly, the explanation was scheduling. Privately, Duvall now confirms, it was intentional. "We both asked for it," he said. Reporters scrambled. We had learned enough from each other. Even as he spoke, Duvall refused to erase Brando's contribution to cinema. "I learned more from watching him than from anyone," he said. "But I also learned what happens when power goes unchecked. I learned how not to treat people." The revelation sent immediate shockwaves through the industry. Headlines erupted. Duvall exposes Brando's dark side. Commentators debated whether he was rewriting history or revealing what insiders had long whispered. But before the outrage could settle, Duvall named another, this time a friend turned adversary. Publicists froze. "Dustin Hoffman," he said, "the credit thief who never stopped." If the Brando story was about ego, this one was about trust. The two had once shared a cramped apartment in New York City long before fame found them. 2 struggling actors rehearsing lines under dim light, living on cheap coffee and second-hand scripts. "We were friends," Duvall said, "or at least I thought we were." He described the early years as a time of constant competition disguised as camaraderie. They would rehearse for hours, trading roles, refining dialogue, shaping characters for stage auditions. Duvall would spend weeks perfecting an interpretation only to discover Hoffman performing it days later at the same theater. "He would take what I had built, word for word," Duvall recalled. And audiences who had grown up watching him as the embodiment of grace and professionalism were left wondering, what kind of truth could force a man like this to speak after 60 years of composure? And then call it inspiration. It was not an isolated incident. The pattern continued as both men rose through the ranks. During the making of True Grit and Midnight Cowboy, Hoffman would phone Duvall for advice, asking about accents, mannerisms, and vocal phrasing. Duvall, ever generous, shared what he knew. Weeks later, he would read interviews in which Hoffman claimed to have developed those ideas through months of observation. That was not collaboration, Duvall said. That was theft. The final rupture came during the casting of The French Connection in 1971. Both men were considered for the lead. In the wake of his confession, the entertainment world found itself facing a mirror it did not wish to hold. Hoffman, according to Duvall, privately warned director William Friedkin that Duvall was difficult and uncooperative. The role went to Gene Hackman. Duvall never forgot. That crossed a line, he said. Competition is natural. Sabotage is not. When confronted years later, Hoffman denied ever saying it. Duvall claimed he had heard the story directly from Friedkin himself. That was when I stopped taking his calls, he said flatly. Yet what makes the revelation haunting is not the betrayal itself, but the grace with which Duvall hid it. For years, it had celebrated legends as if harmony were the rule, and rivalry the exception. For decades, he shared panels with Hoffman, appeared in retrospectives, and offered polite compliments about his performances. That is what professionalism meant back then, he said. You protect the work, even if the people behind it do not deserve protection. Industry insiders have since corroborated elements of his account. One casting assistant from The French Connection confirmed that Hoffman had indeed raised concerns about Duvall's temperament. Whether that cost him the role remains uncertain. What is certain is that Duvall's career and Hollywood's understanding of its legends was forever altered. The second revelation carried a different sting from the first. Brando's arrogance was almost mythic, predictable in its scale. Hoffman's betrayal, however, was intimate, but Duvall's revelation suggests otherwise. It came not from a rival god, but from a supposed brother. The kind of wound that heals only when truth finally replaces politeness. As the interview went on, the air around Duvall grew heavier, the confessions more personal. But even then, his tone never slipped into anger. I am not condemning them, he said. I am simply describing what happened. History deserves accuracy, not fiction. By the time he finished recounting the stories of Brando and Hoffman, the journalist sat motionless, caught between awe and disbelief. The tape recorder hummed softly. Duvall exhaled, long and steady, as if releasing 6 decades of tension. The man who stood for integrity when the lights dimmed and the cameras stopped rolling. Behind every smile on a red carpet, behind every award speech about family, there may have been wounds that never healed. And then, after a pause that felt like the breath between storms, he added quietly, but if the first 2 names shocked Hollywood, the third cut even deeper, and because it came from family. The next name came with a long silence. Duvall looked down for a moment, his hands folded in front of him, as if weighing whether to continue. Then he spoke. James Caan, he said softly, competitive to the point of malice. For decades, audiences had believed they were brothers. The calm strategist Tom Hagen and the fiery Sonny Corleone, united by blood and betrayal in The Godfather. On screen, their chemistry was electric. Off-screen, Duvall revealed, it was barely civil. It began during rehearsals, he said. The image of him sitting in that interview chair and hands clasped, eyes steady, framed by the dim light of a lifetime's reflection, has already become iconic. We were both searching for authority inside that ensemble. Jimmy wanted to dominate every scene, every frame. The rivalry grew in subtle gestures, timing, posture, the art of stealing focus without a word. During early table reads, Caan would crack jokes over Duvall's lines, turn serious moments into comic relief. At first, Duvall ignored it. I thought it was energy, he said. Then I realized it was competition. By the time cameras rolled, the tension had hardened. In one of the most iconic sequences, the family meeting where the Corleones debate whether to go to Waro, Caan allegedly improvised gestures and noises designed to pull attention from Duvall's dialogue. He would tap the table, shift his chair, fiddle with his tie. The moment felt less like gossip and more like history correcting itself. Nothing blatant, but enough for the camera to find him. When Duvall confronted him, Caan brushed it off with a grin. "Lighten up, counselor," he said. "It's only a movie." That was when the transformation occurred, not in James Caan, but in Robert Duvall. "I decided to make it part of Tom Hagen," he said. "From that day on, I played every scene as if Hagen was quietly observing Sonny, anticipating his every outburst. I turned resentment into realism. The result was legendary." Critics later praised the dynamic between them as the perfect portrayal of two brothers bound by loyalty and doomed by temperament. According to those close to him, Duvall's decision was not born from bitterness or fading relevance. Few knew that authenticity came not from acting, but from survival. In public, Duvall and Caan maintained the illusion. They laughed together on red carpets, embraced during anniversary interviews, and spoke warmly about their brotherhood. Privately, they spoke little at all. "We protected the film," Duvall explained. "That mattered more than feelings." Years later, when Caan passed away, Duvall paid his respects with dignity. "We did good work together," he told reporters. "That is all that needs to be said." But now, in the quiet honesty of age, he allowed himself a fuller truth. It came from something deeper, a desire to set the record straight before time runs out. "He was talented, but he needed to win," Duvall said. "I needed the work to matter more than victory. That is the difference between us." The admission was not cruel. It was almost tender. It revealed a kind of liberation-y, the understanding that rivalry had sharpened him rather than destroyed him. Yet before the audience could process that note of forgiveness, Duvall spoke again, this time with the faintest trace of bitterness. The last name, he said, was the hardest to keep quiet about. Because it was not rivalry. It was hypocrisy. He paused, then looked directly into the camera. For decades, he watched documentaries and tributes turn tension into friendship and manipulation into collaboration. "Robert Redford," he said. "The fraud behind the golden image." The room seemed to contract around the words. Even the interviewer leaned forward, unsure if he had heard correctly. Duvall continued, his tone steady, without malice, just exhaustion. "Redford built a perfect mask," he said. "The serious artist, the environmentalist, the champion of purity in film. But behind that mask I saw arrogance that corroded everything around it." Their paths crossed on The Natural in 1984, a film about integrity, redemption, and the mythology of heroism. Ironically, what happened behind the scenes betrayed all three. Revisionist nonsense, he called it. Duvall recalled long hours on set, crews standing idle while Redford delayed shooting. He would spend hours on the phone handling business deals, Duvall said. People waited, losing daylight, losing patience. He called it preparation. I called it self-importance. The true conflict emerged not in delays, but in control. Redford, already a global icon, began influencing creative decisions. Scenes that challenged his character's image were quietly trimmed. Dialogues that balanced perspective at Sace, especially those featuring Duvall's journalist, Max Mercial-Techa, were rewritten. He saw any strong presence as a threat, Duvall said. As he looked back at montages of his greatest performances, what the audience saw as harmony, he remembered as hostility. Then came the confrontation. During post-production, Duvall confronted Redford about the cuts. Crew members later confirmed what happened. Redford listened, smiled faintly, and said, "You are a character actor, Bob. I am a movie star. We're not playing by the same rules." That single sentence, Duvall admitted, crystallized everything. It was the moment I understood how false the legend could be. The man who preached collaboration at Sundance was the same man who silenced collaborators on set. When asked whether he regretted doing The Natural, Duvall shook his head. Old betrayals resurfaced. "No," he said. "It was a good film. but I wish the truth behind it had been as pure as the story. The revelation of Redford's behavior hit harder than any before. This was not youthful rivalry or artistic conflict, it was moral disillusionment. Hollywood had spent decades venerating Redford as the embodiment of integrity. Now, one of its most disciplined veterans had pulled the curtain back. Industry responses were swift but cautious. Representatives for Redford declined comment. Younger actors expressed gratitude, saying Duvall's honesty felt like permission to stop pretending. Old names echoed. Among his peers, a quiet respect replaced shock. "It takes courage to tell the truth when you have nothing left to gain," one director remarked. Through it all, Duvall remained composed. He did not gloat, nor apologize. "I am not rewriting history," he said. "I am removing the varnish." The interviewer, now visibly shaken, asked whether he believed these confessions would change anything. Duvall smiled faintly. "Maybe not," he said. "But sometimes, telling the truth is not about changing the world." The one colleagues described as unshakable, disciplined, and beyond reproach. And in that instant, he decided the truth would outlive diplomacy. It is about freeing yourself from it. He looked away, eyes glinting under the studio lights. For a moment, the man who had once embodied silence seemed lighter, almost translucent, as if unburdened. Then, almost to himself, he added, "Those four stood out, but they were not alone." The aftermath of Robert Duvall's confession spread through Hollywood like an aftershock that refused to fade. In the days that followed, his name dominated headlines. Talk shows dissected his words. Studios issued statements of respect, and journalists scrambled to verify details from half a century ago. It was not just a story about old rivalries, it had become a mirror held up to the entire industry. For decades, Hollywood had built its legends on symmetry: heroes without flaws, collaborations without cracks. Duvall's honesty shattered that symmetry. For the first time, Hollywood's most discreet actor has chosen exposure over silence, honesty over mythology. He had reminded the world that the art of illusion did not end when the camera stopped rolling. It continued in the myths people told to protect reputations. Reactions were divided. Some called his interview a necessary correction. Others accused him of tarnishing legacies. But beneath the noise, something deeper took root. Younger actors began speaking, quietly at first, about their own experiences with ego and manipulation on set. Directors revisited the past with new curiosity, wondering how many harmonious productions had actually been held together by fear or silence. Representatives for Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford, the only living names on Duvall's list, released brief statements. They expressed admiration for his career, surprise at his descriptions, and a desire not to engage further. Neither denied. And before revealing the four names that have sent shockwaves through the film world, we must first understand why Robert Duvall finally chose to break his silence. Neither confirmed. Neither confirmed. And perhaps that, in its own way, spoke loudest. Among Duvall's peers, reactions were more nuanced. Francis Ford Coppola called his words painful but not unfair. Crew members from The Natural quietly affirmed parts of his account. Even former assistants, long retired, described him as the most professional man on any setish, but also the loneliest. When reached for a follow-up comment, Duvall did not gloat or retract. "I have no interest in feuds," he said. "I only wanted the record to reflect what really happened. We owe that much to the truth." The theater was bathed in golden light that night. The remark revealed what had driven him all along, not revenge, but reconciliation with himself, with history, with the contradictions of a life spent performing honesty inside a system built on disguise. In that sense, his revelations were less an act of destruction than one of restoration. They stripped away the polish and left behind something raw, imperfect, and human. The very qualities that made Robert Duvall the actor audiences revered now defined him as a man unafraid of imperfection. As the frenzy faded, a quieter legacy emerged. The interview became required viewing in acting workshops and film schools. not for its scandals but for its truth. Students studied his calm delivery, his refusal to exaggerate, his commitment to precision. In that discipline lay the final lesson of his career, that honesty, like craft, demands courage. In the end, Duvall's confession was not about the four names, but about a single idea, that truth, no matter how inconvenient, is the only performance that cannot be faked. He closed the interview with a faint smile. A sea of faces, polished shoes, and whispered admiration filled the air as Robert Duvall, stoic as ever, sat in the front row. "I have given 60 years to this industry," he said. "It deserves to be remembered as it was, not as we wish it had been." The camera lingered on him for a moment, capturing the stillness that had once defined his on-screen power. Then, softly, the frame faded to black. And as the world continues to debate his words, one question remains, says, what would you have done after 60 years of silence? Tell us below, and subscribe to uncover the untold truths behind Hollywood's legends. The tribute reel flickered to life, painting his career in perfect harmony. Montage after montage of his greatest performances shimmered across the screen. The Godfather, Apocalypse, now Tender Mercies. The narration spoke of lifelong friendships, unbreakable collaborations, and the dignity of craft. But as the applause swelled and the crowd rose to its feet, Duvall remained still. His expression did not match the celebration. Through wars on screen and storms off-screen, he remained the constant, Hollywood's gentleman, the actor who never lost his center. To most, it looked like humility. To those closest to him, it looked like quiet conflict. Because as he watched those smiling faces appear on screen, the same faces that had once undermined, dismissed, and betrayed him mind, he realized he was witnessing not a tribute, but a lie. According to those present that night, something shifted within him. The man who had spent his life guarding his dignity suddenly looked weary of guarding illusions. He had watched for years as Hollywood rewrote its own history, smoothing every fracture into a polished legend. But now, at 94, the revisionism had gone too far. He felt like history was being rewritten in front of him, said a longtime associate who requested anonymity. He could not let that stand. In the weeks that followed, Duvall withdrew from public events. That is why what happened this week has left the industry speechless. The calls from friends went unanswered. He stopped granting interviews. Those who knew him well said he had entered what they called a season of reckoning. He spent hours in his study, surrounded by old scripts and photographs, marking names in the margins, drawing circles around forgotten notes, revisiting scenes that had defined his life. Each one, he later said, carried a truth that had been neatly erased by nostalgia. When the interviewer finally sat down with him months later, they expected a reflective conversation, a retrospective on legacy. Instead, they found a man ready to correct the record. It was not anger, said the journalist who conducted the interview. It was precision. He wanted to get it right. At 94, the Oscar-winning legend broke his silence. Duvall began by speaking of silence, not the comfortable kind, but the one that hardens over time, the silence of professionalism, of letting lies breathe because confronting them feels undignified. "I was raised to believe that keeping your mouth shut was part of being a gentleman," he said. But silence only protects those who lie loudest. He described decades of watching documentaries that turned rivalry into brotherhood and manipulation into creative tension. He said he had tolerated it all because the work itself had survived. But as time thinned his patience, another truth emerged. The work might live on, but the truth was dying. Those close to him insist the decision to speak was not impulsive. It began quietly, in the isolation of reflection. He watched younger actors struggle to navigate the same politics he had once endured. The false mentorships, the subtle betrayals, the public facades. He felt responsible, said a former assistant. And, in a voice steady but edged with finality, he named 4 people he simply could not stand. He said the next generation deserves to know that greatness often comes from conflict, not harmony. And so, with his legacy already secured, Duvall decided to risk the one thing he had always protected, his reputation for discretion. "At my age, reputation means less than truth," he told the interviewer. "History will remember what I said, not what I hid." The industry was unprepared. In the echo of his words, old narratives began to unravel. The actor long celebrated for restraint had chosen revelation instead. The man who had personified professionalism now revealed that professionalism had often meant silence in the face of abuse, deception, and arrogance. As the interview progressed, the tension deepened. The journalist later recalled how Duvall's tone would change depending on the memory. Some moments carried the warmth of camaraderie, others the chill of betrayal. "I've kept my mouth shut for decades," he told his interviewer. But through it all, he spoke without bitterness. "This is not about vengeance," he said quietly. "It is about clarity." Behind that clarity lay decades of restraint. On film sets where tempers flared and egos clashed, he had always chosen composure. On panels and award stages, he had smiled beside men who once tried to sabotage his work. Every gesture, every public courtesy had been part of the same unspoken pact: keep the peace, preserve the myth. But myths, he now believed, had cost too much truth. To the younger actors who grew up seeing him as the embodiment of control, Duvall offered a different lesson. "Even the greatest films," he said, "are not born of harmony. But at this age, what am I waiting for? They are born of conflict, jealousy, and endurance. But if you endure without honesty, the conflict wins." By the end of the interview's first hour, the room had grown heavy. The camera operator stopped breathing loudly. Every word carried the weight of decades. And when the interviewer asked the question everyone had been waiting for was, "Who were the people who hurt you the most?" Duvall paused for a long time. Then he leaned forward, his hands folded, his eyes steady. The air seemed to thicken between words. What followed would break through Hollywood's polished mythology and expose the fractures beneath its brightest lights. Before revealing the four names, we must first understand how the silence became unbearable and why Robert Duvall finally decided it was time to speak.